Matthew chapter 16, verses 16 through 18. Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it."
Arise, arise, the Master calls to you. Arise, arise today. He calls for you to go and spread the news. Arise, awake, awake. Salvation calls to every man, his greatest need of all. May blessed men who learn the way be faithful to the call. Arise, arise, the Master calls to you. Arise, arise today. He calls for you to go and spread the news. Arise, awake, awake. Salvation calls to every man, his greatest need of all. May blessed men who've learned the way be faithful to the call.
Suffering and Satan. What's the connection? I mean, think about that because as we think about the suffering that we see in the world, many times we immediately want to attribute that to Satan and somehow, it's connected with him. And I want us to think about what the connection actually is. And more importantly than just think about it, I want us to read a passage that, well, it might shed some new light on this topic. So let's take a look together at Matthew chapter 16 and let's see if there is a connection. And if there is a connection, what's the connection between Satan and suffering? The passage that we're going to look at first, we're actually going to be looking at three different passages, but the first one starts off like this. In Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 23, and this will serve as the main passage that we will kind of take a look at and work our way through. We read, "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. 'Never, Lord,' he said, 'this shall never happen to you.' Jesus turned and said to Peter, 'Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns.'" Now, this is amazing. This is an amazing passage because it really does combine these two thoughts that we oftentimes, kind of want to talk about is what's the connection between suffering and Satan? Because of course, if we want to, we can go back and we can say that, all of our suffering that happens to us in the world, it goes back to that original moment in Genesis 3 that we call the fall, right? That's what we refer to it as. The very first temptation, we see that Adam and Eve, they fell into that temptation. They gave over into what the serpent was doing there, and we know the serpent is Satan. So we might want to just point all of our fingers to Satan and say he's to blame for all the suffering that we see in the world. However, this passage takes everything in a very different way than how we normally would. For starters, Satan is not referred to as any type of a snake type creature. No, the one who is called Satan is Peter. Now, yes, this is the same Peter, the same one who preached on the day of Pentecost, the one who, right before this, and by the way, we're about to look at that passage, but right before this, he just made this bold statement of faith. Yes, it's that Peter. It's also that same Peter who denied our Lord 3 times, just as he denied that he even knew him whenever things were starting to heat up and it was looking not too good for Jesus. Peter said, "I don't know the guy." He said that 3 times. But yes, this is that same Peter, and right here he is called Satan. It says, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, the term Satan, it just means, the accuser, but that term is, of course, well, it has all types of connections with it because in this term of Satan, yes, we see that it's the accuser, but, we also see the one who is kind of, an adversary, the one who is opposed to. And right here, now we see how this word is being used. Peter is called Satan because he is trying to place this stumbling block before Jesus. In fact, that's why he says in verse 23, Jesus says to Peter, "You are a stumbling block to me." Why? And he says, "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Okay, so we look through this suffering. The suffering that we are talking about as we go to verse 21 is the suffering that Jesus is going to endure right before that time that he is going to be killed on the cross, and then on the third day he's raised from the dead. This is kind of a three categories that we see, three things that are listed, and Jesus is going to list these in different ways. But the first things is there's some type of suffering that's going to take place. He is going to be killed, but he is going to raise up from the dead. Now, if you actually kind of look at what happens here, I believe what we see from Jesus' disciples, they hear him say these things and they just kind of wonder, okay, what do you think he's maybe talking about here? What type of parable is he saying right here? The amazing thing is he is very plain to them. He tells them on three different occasions. We're going to look at those. This is the first one. From this time on, Jesus is telling them these things. He keeps preparing them. Have you ever had to repeat something more than once? Yes. Okay, we've all had to repeat something more than once so that somebody else gets it. Well, right here, Jesus needed to repeat more than once that he was going to suffer, he was going to be killed, but he is going to rise up from the dead. Now, that type of thing didn't happen just every day, of course. It still doesn't happen every day. But it did happen this one time, and it was very important. But this suffering right here, as we look at it, yes, you can tie in the sufferings of Christ back to Satan, and yes, you could even maybe kind of look at that prophecy from Genesis 3:15, oftentimes stated as the very first prophecy about the Messiah, and it was connected with the serpent and the serpent's offsprings, and then the offspring of Eve. You could kind of say that, okay, about crushing the head and then crushing the heel and bruising the head, bruising the heel, whatever maybe you're kind of used to reading in your translation. You can go back to there and you can connect all this suffering and you can say that. But, ultimately what you get to is this suffering that Jesus was going to be enduring in Jerusalem was something that God had set up. In fact, it's that same suffering that, if you remember, on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he prayed that if there was any way that it would work out and he wouldn't have to go through the suffering that he was going to. But he ultimately surrendered his will to the will of the Father. That's a lesson for us to learn. Sometimes we need to surrender our will to the will of the Father. And in Jesus' case, when he surrendered his will to the will of the Father, that meant he was going to have to suffer. And it also meant that he was going to be killed, but he was going to rise up from the dead. When Peter heard that, he just couldn't take it. And he actually said, "No, never, Lord. This isn't going to happen. This shall never happen to you." That's why Jesus looks at him and says, "Get behind me, Satan." See, what Satan was actually trying to do in this time was trying to find, a different way than what the Father had already laid out. The way of the Father was that his Son was going to suffer, his Son was going to be killed, and his Son was going to be raised on the third day. So is there a connection between suffering and Satan? Yes, but not how we might think. In fact, Satan in this passage is not the one that we might think. So as we look at this passage together, what I want us to do now is we're going to spend more time on this one, and it was going to kind of serve as a little bit of a kind of an outline for the other two. But this first one that we see, okay, so this is what he says, and he says, from this time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples. Okay, so something has changed in the story of Matthew, because as you're reading, you've got 16 chapters, and he's not really talked too much about this. I mean, maybe you can say that he's kind of referenced it a little bit, but he's not really talked so much about it. But now we get something's changed. From this time on, Jesus is going to explain to his disciples these things right here. So what has happened right before this? Let's back up just a little bit. The context right before it, in Matthew chapter 16, I'm just going to read this, verses 13 through 20. This is an amazing passage, actually. I've kind of looked at it maybe a few months ago. I guess those really are just weeks anyways, aren't they? But Matthew 16, 13 through 20, this is the story we read. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." When Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, For this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. So here in this passage, he starts off by asking, who do people say the Son of Man is? Okay, they say a lot of things, don't they? People say a lot of things. But then in verse 15, he gets very specific to his disciples, and he says, but what about you now? Who do you say that I am? And he's asking this question, all of them, who do you all say that I am? And that's a good question for us to ask, isn't it? Who do we say that Jesus is? Well, Peter steps up and he answers for us, and he says, you are the Messiah. You are the Son of the living God. And Jesus loves his answer. And he said, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. And he tells him this answer, it came from the Father. So right here, Peter is right on target. He knows exactly what everything's about. He's answered the pop quiz correctly. And then after this, that's where we get the story from verses 21 through 23 about how the Messiah is going to suffer many things, be killed, and on the third day raised up to life. And then Jesus looks at Peter, that same guy that he just said, oh, you're blessed because you're right on target. You're right in line with the Father. But right now, Jesus turned and said to Peter in verse 23, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. And then he explains why. He says, you do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. That was the problem right here. Because Peter was thinking about his own way of doing things, or really how Jesus, should do things, right? Whenever we start off a sentence thinking what Jesus should or shouldn't do in certain situations, let's be careful with that one. Maybe take a step back and realize instead of what we think Jesus should or shouldn't do in certain situations, what did he do in this or that situation? Look through the Gospels. You will find many examples of those things. But Peter, he's got his own mind as to what Jesus should do or shouldn't do. And he doesn't think these things should happen to Jesus. But we know, well, this was part of the plan. This was part of submitting to the will of the Father. There was going to be suffering. He was going to be killed. And he was going to be raised up on the third day, raised back to life. So Peter did not have his concerns right. And that's why Satan crept up in this passage. Satan creeps up in this passage because Satan is opposed to the things of Christ. And here, Peter was being opposed to the concerns of God. He was thinking about just human concerns. How easy that is for us to do sometimes. By the way, I said the context of it is going to set a foundation. This is going to be kind of like a bit of an overview for the other passages. So let's see, we've seen what came right before it. But now let's look what comes right after this. Because he's going to elaborate on what it means that Peter did not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Well, we've got to do better than that. We've got to be better than that. And I would say that Peter, he does better. He is going to do better in the future. But right here, this is his moment. This is what he has turned to. If we continue on in the context right after it, in Matthew chapter 16, verses 24 through 28, this is how the conversation continues on. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his glory. What an amazing passage. He looks at his disciples, the ones who are following, and he says, this is what it means. That if you're going to be my disciple, if you're going to follow me, you got to deny yourself. You got to take up your cross. You got to follow me. And taking up your cross and following me, that means following Jesus to the point of death, because that's what the cross was all about, was you take up your cross, you're going to die. You're going to walk to your death. And Jesus says, look, if you're going to be my disciple, you got to take up that cross and you got to follow me. All the way, completely, fully committed. That's what he is talking about right here. And then he's talking about this thing about gaining your life, losing your life, going back and forth. And I'm sure that the disciples are thinking, what type of parable is this? What do you mean by life? In fact, sometimes we even get a little bit of insight that the disciples did even ask themselves, what do you think he meant by this phrase or that phrase? Well, right here, he's talking pretty plainly. And he's telling them about a time in which the Son of Man is going to come, and he is going to reward each person for what they've done. What are the things that you've done? What are the things that I've done? I mean, it's not like we can hide them from God. It's not like we can hide them from the Son of Man. All things will be revealed at some point in the future. But if we are going to be a faithful follower of Christ, a disciple of Christ, we must take up our cross and we must follow him to the very, very end. Now, as we've already looked, I've said that Jesus is going to continue to make this statement several other times, and he's going to continue to make it. So we looked at the first time, and it was right here, and that's whenever he says that he's going to suffer, he's going to be killed, and then he's going to rise up from the dead. That was the first time in Matthew chapter 16. Now let's take a look at the next time. We don't have to go very far. It comes to us in Matthew chapter 17, verses 22 through 23. When they had come together in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life." And the disciples were filled with grief. Now maybe you kind of start wondering, are they maybe catching on to that, actually what he's talking about? And by the way, I said that the previous passage was going to serve as kind of a little bit of an outline. So yes, here's the outline. Earlier in this passage, what happens in Matthew chapter 17 at the beginning is that's the Mount of Transfiguration. You remember that time whenever Jesus was transfigured, and we might look at that in the future, but we're not doing that so much today. But whenever Jesus was transfigured, he appeared there with Moses and Elijah. But then there was this voice from heaven that happened in chapter 17, verse 5, that stated, "This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." They were given that call. It was about Jesus. They needed to listen to the Son of God, this Son of Man. They needed to listen to him. And what the Son of Man is saying is, he's going to be delivered up to the hands of men. They're going to kill him, but on the third day he's going to be raised to life. The disciples were sad. They were filled with grief. They didn't still quite get it, but they realized it was bad. Yeah, suffering is not really a good thing. It's never mentioned as a good thing in the scriptures. But sometimes, for whatever reason, it's something that we must go through. Now, Jesus, of course, the reason behind it was so that we can have joy, so that we can have life. That was the reason why he went through his suffering. Our suffering is not always going to necessarily produce something quite so good. But if you were to look at Jesus' suffering while he was going through it, it didn't look good either. Sometimes we don't know what our suffering is going to produce in us until afterwards. And sometimes it's not even about us. Maybe sometimes our suffering produces something in someone else. And we're just called to submit to the will of the Father and to allow him to be in control, because he is. He always is. So this is the second occasion. Now the third occasion, let's skip forward just a few more chapters. In Matthew chapter 20, verses 17 through 19, now we see what's happening. Because right here we see that Jesus is going up to Jerusalem. Okay? Let's look at this and read this together. Now Jesus was going up to Jerusalem. On the way he took the 12 aside and said to them, "We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. On the third day he will be raised to life." So here we see once again the three main things, and yeah, there's a little bit of differences in each one of these passages, but yes, Jesus is going to be delivered over. Yeah, that's part of what is going to happen to him. He's going to be condemned to death. They're going to kill him. And we also find out even how. It's not just the Jewish people, but it's also the Gentiles here. They're going to mock him. They're going to flog him. They're going to crucify him. But then we see in verse 19 that once again, on the third day, he's going to be raised to life. So now as you look at Matthew chapter 20, let's talk about what happened earlier. What happened earlier, you got to go back into the end of chapter 19, because you actually see this amazing language about the Son of Man is going to be on his glorious throne. And there's going to be 12 thrones for the apostles as well, right? And then even after this passage, after he's talked about everything that's going to happen to him, being the Son of Man, after that, he's going to later have this conversation, because his disciples are going to come to him and they're going to say, "Hey Jesus, can we sit at your right and your left hand?" Whoa. They don't have the right idea as to what Jesus is all about and what Jesus is doing. And also in the next chapter, we see that we're getting closer and closer to what is taking place, because in the next chapter, that's where we get the triumphal entry. He's going to enter into Jerusalem right here. He's going up to Jerusalem. As he goes to Jerusalem, oh, they praise him. They're so happy to see him. Everything is wonderful. But remember, he's already told his disciples 3 times what's going to happen. On those 3 times, what he said, and here's these passages again, maybe if you want to write them down from Matthew chapter 16, Matthew chapter 17, and then Matthew chapter 20. The 3 things, in essence, are he's going to be delivered over to the Jews, and he's going to suffer. The second thing is he's going to be killed. They're going to crucify him. He's already kind of stated that. Then the third thing is he is going to be raised on the 3rd day, back to life. Now, whenever you hear this, the disciples have heard this 3 different times, and this is not what you want to hear about Jesus. This is not, Jesus he's the King of Kings. He's the one who's supposed to sit on the throne. He's going to bring all this order into the world, and he's talking about dying. He's talking about all this suffering. The disciples just didn't seem to understand. But you know what? Interestingly enough, other people did understand something about what Jesus was saying. In fact, if we fast forward to a passage after he has already died, in Matthew chapter 17, the ones who were opposed to him, they understood at least something about his message. Because after Jesus' death, we read in Matthew chapter 27, verses 62 through 66. We read, "The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. 'Sir,' they said, 'we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, "After 3 days I will rise again." So give the orders for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first.' 'Take a guard,' Pilate answered. 'Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how.' So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard." Now you know what happens after this. You know that this is in the midst of what Jesus had already talked about. Okay? By this point, he had already gone to Jerusalem, and he'd already been handed over into their hands. They'd already done what they wanted to. He'd already suffered. That's the first thing. He'd already suffered. He had also already been killed by this point, but he said he was going to raise up on the 3rd day. That's why they quote him, and they say, "Oh, well, this deceiver." They're talking about Jesus right here, and they call him a deceiver, and they say, "Well, he said, after 3 days I'll rise again." They knew that was coming, and they were scared. They wanted to make all the preparations they could to make sure that didn't happen, but it still did. On the 3rd day, he raised up. That's what Matthew chapter 28, the wonderful ending of Matthew's gospel, is all about, that Jesus raised up from the dead. But as we look, that was still part of the process. In order for him to bring this good news, in order for him to conquer death, was he had to suffer, he had to die, he had to be killed, and then he had to raise up from the dead on that 3rd day. This is at the heart of the gospel. And I wanted us to look at these passages together to kind of get a better understanding about the connection between suffering and Satan, because it's not always what it might appear at first, and it might not always be what we immediately think about it. But there's so much we can learn if we look at these words and where they appear, and we look at how Jesus and what he was teaching his disciples. Remember that one of the things that he taught his disciples that we still teach today is, if we want to be a disciple of Jesus, we've got to deny ourselves. We've got to take up our cross, and we've got to follow him every day of our life. I hope that you've made the decision already to do that. And if not, why not do it today? Because you know that Jesus' story doesn't end right here. It doesn't end in death. It ends in life, a new life. And he promises to give us life as well. All of us who are his disciples, all of us who are following him, death is not going to get the final say. Suffering is not going to be the last word. There is salvation. There is deliverance. There is new life, new hope on the other side of death.
How did it feel? How did it feel? How did it feel? How did it feel to wake up Sunday morning in the darkness of the tomb, to feel your breath rise, to feel your breath rise, to open your eyes, to open your eyes? How did it feel? How did it feel? The nail brings pride, the nail brings pride. How did it feel? How did it feel? How did it feel to show you're alive? How did it feel? How did it feel? How did it feel? How did it feel to conquer over Satan as the victor o'er the grave, to rise in the sky, to rise in the sky, exalted on